Welcome back to Exhibit A List, where we talk about pop culture lawsuits and things that are just interesting in the legal space and break them down in a fun and approachable way. Some quick housekeeping. You can find me on Instagram at JasmineWegESQ as well as at Exhibit A List Pod. JasmineWegESQ is where I do all the things legal, and at Exhibit A List Pod is the podcast handle. And then I'm also on TikTok at Jazz the Lawyer. Find me at all the places and connect. I love to talk and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Today's is interesting. I gotta start at 50 Cent, Diddy, and The Reckoning because it's been on my mind all week and let's talk about it. We've heard versions of the stories that they're talking about in the documentary for years, but what's interesting here isn't even the allegations themselves. What's different is how people are reacting to them now. The documentary centers on claims that Sean Diddy Combs played a role in orchestrating Tupac Shakur's murder, pointing to statements that allegedly were made by Keefe D. Davis, and he is the man that authorities say was the ringleader in Tupac's killing. Keefe D was arrested in 2023, and his trial isn't scheduled to 2026. That gives this moment a very different weight than past interviews because now this documentary was just released and we have someone who's going to be on trial for Tupac's killing. For years, these stories have lived in a very specific category. They were conspiracy, hip hop lore, things that people always whispered about and never took too seriously or never could 100% say one way or the other. They were easy to dismiss, easy to roll your eyes around. But suddenly people aren't doing that anymore. You can see it in the way the comments read. You can see it in how people are now rewatching old interviews. You can see it in how the skepticism feels softer than it used to be. The documentary doesn't just focus on Tupac, it also strongly suggests that Diddy may have had some involvement in, or at the very least, benefited enormously from Biggie Smalls' death. After Biggie died, Diddy's influence went wild. His legacy expanded. We know he did that major song after the death. The business empire grew, power structure shifted. And again, that's not a new observation, but the way it's being received is. And part of that has to do with timing. We're in an era where people are far more willing to revisit powerful figures with fresh eyes. And what's interesting is there are a lot of stories where people, basically on social media or on Reddit, people on TikTok are opening cold cases or re-examining cases that the prosecutors and police think that they've put to rest and laying fresh eyes on it, and then courts and prosecutors are reopening that case. So there is power in people giving new eyes or new attention to cases. We saw it with the Mendez brothers. That might be why their case ended up in appeal when the documentary hit, and then there was public outrage for how their case was handled. Industries that once protected their own are being interrogated publicly. Long-standing silence isn't being treated as proof of innocence anymore. It's being treated as something worth questioning. Part of it is 50 Cent himself. This documentary isn't positioned as neutral. It's positioned as a counter-narrative. He has said that he deliberately wants to pull together decades of interviews, footage, and private materials that's existed in pieces, but it's never been assembled in this way. So this never-before-seen footage, it doesn't mean that it's brand new information, but he's contextualizing it in a new way. It's never been mainstream before, never been presented before as a cohesive story. So when this information before lived in fragments, it was easy for people to ignore it. But now it's a narrative and people are engaging with it. It makes it feel more than another true crime documentary. It's colliding with something else. It's an active prosecution that's happening at the same time. Because like I said, Keefe D hasn't gone to trial yet, and that's happening in the coming year. So there's still years before this gets resolved, and that creates a strange tension. People are watching history, rumor, and legal reality, and it's overlapping in real time, and they can have an effect in it. No one knows where this ultimately will go. But the reason that this documentary is landing differently isn't because it suddenly proves something. I think it's because it arrives at a moment where audiences are far more open to asking uncomfortable questions about power, silence, and who benefited when certain people disappeared. And once people start asking those questions seriously, even without the answers, the conversation doesn't just quietly go back to where it was before. Now let's shift gears and talk about conversations that happen organically or not so organically online. Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni's story has taken just another interesting turn this week, and not because of anything that actually happened in court, but because of how people started talking about them on the internet itself. So the conversation really kicked off around allegations of a coordinated smear campaign, and we saw this back in the case, but something new came out this week. It was a study pulled by Judea, Gudea, this new company that popped on the scene, and it appeared to be analytics that looked at the online discourse around Blake Lively and also around Taylor Swift, and it claimed that it could identify coordinated activity that amplified negative narratives. So in other words, there was coordinated activity on social media, in the comments, on Reddit, out there that really seemed to be a structured way of talking badly about these girls, about Blake Lively and about Taylor Swift. Okay, for some people, they thought that this made a lot of sense, but other people feel very strongly about their negative beliefs about those two, and they feel like this makes no sense because they truly do feel that they've organically been saying this. And, it's hard to see because opinions about Taylor Swift do switch very quickly online, but it's hard to know whether this is one comment online that's just taking off because people are so quick to hive mentality, or if it's concerted, if people are being paid to say something negative and to do it over and over and over until it becomes a talking piece. I wouldn't be surprised if someone came out and said there's some astroturfing happening around the Wicked movie because there's so much talk online about Ariana Grande and Cynthia Erivo. Forgot her name for a second. But the question is whether that's organic, whether one person sees it and then it just becomes more, or whether this is a concerted paid act. So people didn't just learn a new word, but it gave a name to something that feels familiar. This idea that narrative doesn't have to be invented from scratch. It could be nudged, amplified, like fed to the algorithms in the right places until the real users then adopt them, and then it is organic. And then it is their own opinions. And once that happens, it's not artificial anymore. It actually is real. And that was kind of the point. But what made this more interesting was that this study was released and then people on Reddit started to look into the company. Reddit started Redditing. People started pulling apart the company Judea and they noticed that it kind of popped on the scene rather recently. It had a fairly new LinkedIn. They also noticed that it had a mission statement that said, it was designed to help you control the narrative. What makes it seem like it's involved in astroturfing, or maybe the reverse. So the truth is that two things can exist at the same time. There can be very real organic backlash against public figures, and there probably always is. There is also probably real astroturfing that occurs. We just don't know whether it actually occurred in the case of these people. The two things don't cancel each other out. They compound. It's why the story stuck. It's not really about Blake versus Justin or about proving whether one study got it exactly right, but it's about how quickly public opinion can tip and how hard it is to tell where momentum ends and where manipulation begins once everything is happening in real time. And add to that the fact that Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni's trial has already been delayed, which honestly, no one found shocking. We get this weird disconnect. Online narratives are moving at lightning speed, but the legal process is moving rather slowly. In between those two timelines, reputations are being shaped long before anyone ever testifies, which is why Blake could eventually win in the real court, but she's already lost pretty profoundly in the court of public opinion, at least on socials, at least at what's very visible. So the mechanics of how opinion is formed online suddenly being dragged into the spotlight. Once you start noticing those patterns, though, it's very hard to unsee them. Now we're moving into something that is a little different because Erika Jayne said something really weird and it struck me and I had to repeat it. She said that she was kind of hoping that her husband or her ex-husband, Tom Girardi, would die before he went to prison. That is a wild thing to say out loud. Immediately, it made me stop and go, wait, where exactly is Tom Girardi right now? So I had to go and Google it. And the answer is that he's not in prison. He's not yet in prison, though. And I don't know if he'll make it there. So taking a step back, let's remember Tom Girardi is one of the most famous plaintiffs' attorneys in the country. He was doing these massive cases where he was taking on big business and suing them for massive plaintiff personal injury actions. And then he was disbarred. He was charged with federal wire fraud and charged for embezzling millions of dollars from his very own clients. These clients that were victims of very terrible cases. They were burn victims, their widows, their families, and they had all trusted him for these settlement funds, and he was using it to fund his lavish lifestyle, which Erika Jayne was benefiting from. So apparently, now, because of his age and his mental condition, he's been found incompetent to stand trial and is currently in a memory care facility and not a prison. So this man who the movie Erin Brockovich was based upon and who was like a legendary attorney then turned completely disbarred and scourge upon the legal community is now actually spending time in a facility because his memory has lapsed. And it's part of why Erika's comment landed the way it did. Because right now he's not serving time for the crime he actually did. And it makes me wonder if she feels like, or if she's trying to promote a narrative that maybe he didn't know what he was doing and maybe the crime had to do with his memory issues. She, however, Erika, has always maintained that she had no knowledge of what Tom was doing. From the moment everything started unraveling, you'll remember that she immediately filed for divorce. She went in and she did a sit down with the other housewives and she said, all this crazy stuff about Tom and demonstrated how his mind was unraveling and how miserable she was, and then said she was getting a divorce. She also said she didn't handle the finances. She drew a very hard line between herself and whatever he was up to behind the scenes. And let's not forget, there has never been a prosecution directly against her, which means there might not be a case against her having actual knowledge or being complicit in what he did. She did have her redemption arc, though, on Real Housewives, and it seemed like if she was able to distance herself enough, that was enough for the ladies, and she was able to make her comeback. It doesn't sound like she has sympathy for him. It might be anger, it might be relief, exhaustion, I don't know. It's a weird statement, but the unanswered question here is, will Tom ever go to prison? Do you think he should go to prison? Do you feel like his memory issues and his incompetence mean that he should just spend time in this facility until his days are over? I don't know. It feels funny. I feel like for the families and the victims, they probably want justice. He is an elderly man. I don't know. He still did something very wrong, though. What keeps people watching Erika, though, is they're not trying to solve the case, but they're trying to understand how she survived this fallout. And she did it so calmly and so detachedly. Maybe that's just Erika. Switching gears, though, before we go, we gotta spend a little time in petty court. And today's case is the group chat exit without explanation. I, myself, have committed this crime. You leave a long-standing group chat, family, friends, parents, coworkers, whoever it may be, and you do it with no announcement. No love you guys, no guys, I have to mute for my sanity. You just poof, gone, and you let the questions arise. And now the questions before this court is it self-care or is it a hostile act? Because on the one hand, nobody owes a group chat their peace. But on the other hand, the silence is loud, and it makes everyone say, like, was it a rage quit? Was it a quiet boundary, a power move, or are they just sick of us? Let's be honest, though. The remaining members of the chat aren't immediately going to discuss why you left. So the ruling from my court is as follows. You're absolutely allowed to leave, but don't be surprised when you become a side chat discussion. If you do it silently, you just can't be surprised if they're going to interpret it as shade. The verdict is it's technically legal. Socially, it might be, a little unhinged. Court is adjourned. That is it for this episode. If there is another story that you want me to dive into, please let me know. Please give me a 5-star review. Follow the podcast on Spotify, follow it on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, anywhere you can find it. Please leave comments, leave reviews. It's the best way to let me know that you're here listening and let me know what you want to hear more from. DM me on Instagram or TikTok. We can discuss the pod, discuss your thoughts, and I'd love to hear from you. Stay curious, and I will see you next week.